This is Elgato's 4K60 Pro. It's a 4K60 capture card, and it's $400. There aren't a lot of reviews of this one. It's relatively new. It came out in November. MSRP is about $400, and there aren't many competing products either. The main thing with a capture card like this is that it's more or less plug and play. You could record things locally on the same system using something like Shadowplay or Relive. The only downside with those is you occasionally have issues with, for example, frame time variance, 0.1% lows, 1% lows, dropping off a little bit. And if you're a more serious competitive gamer, you might want an external capture system. That said, the other main use case would be with consoles. And it's a bit peculiar there because at 4K60, you really only have two consoles that can even do that. The Xbox One X and whatever the new PS4 is called, Pro. And with those, there are very few games that actually do 60 FPS. So it's more like 4K30. So we're going to review this today, and as you can see, we've got thermocouples hooked up to it just for a bit of an extra thermal test out of pure curiosity. Before that, this video is brought to you by the new CableMod Pro series. CableMod's new Pro cables come with pre-installed closed combs for clean builds, accompanied by a revamped color, style, and vibrance. The cables are now using thicker wires, and they've also added right-angled internal USB 3 extension and right-angled SATA data cables. Buy the Pro Series cable kits at the link below, or customize your cable set with the configurator also linked below. We've been using this capture card to record our Xbox footage for benchmarking. One of the reasons we got into the decision to review it was because one of the very few reviews of this specific card on Amazon by a user said something like, I thought this internal PCIe x 4 device would work with my laptop. So clearly, we need to talk about that. This is an internal card. First of all, in terms of the looks, it looks like it's got a giant heatsink on the front and on the back. It doesn't. We'll get there and talk about that. In terms of the capabilities, it does 4K60. The software by default allows you to do up to 140 megabits per second. Using Virtual Dub, OBS, or some other software, you could go higher than 140 megabits per second and do so more or less without introducing any significant lag. There is a point at which you would find that the stutter or lag or drop frames, but you can still go higher than 140. The company says that the card works best with GTX 10 series and AMD Vega cards. We tested it all the way down to a 960. It's fine. Technically speaking, this is where it gets more interesting. This card has no on-device encoder. So it actually doesn't do any encoding work. And it helps. It does some of the processing. But ultimately, it's pushing that work off to either your CPU or your GPU. You can select which. So if it's going to CPU or GPU, on the GPU with NVIDIA, you'd be relying on NV encoders. A GTX 1080 or Ti would have two NV encoders. Everything below them would have one NV encoder. We found that a 1060 or a 960 could still process 140 megabits per second without issue. You might be able to go a bit higher than that with two NV encoders, but because you're on an external capture machine anyway, it's not consuming nearly as much resources as on the same machine. AMD has its own encoder as well. But you could do either CPU or GPU, and then at that point, you're really just piping the video out of the console or the PC into another one. And this has two HDMI ports on the back. So no DisplayPort, unfortunately, but if you think about the target market, probably consoles, that makes sense. Again, there's a bit of an oddity in that not many games actually do 60 FPS, but this is capable for the ones that can. And a quick addendum on that, clearly talking about consoles there, not about PCs. So it doesn't seem like this thing's flying off the shelves, which speaks more to the current demand for 4K 60 FPS streaming than anything. If you're not bottlenecked by the game, basically, you're bottlenecked by your upload speed. So not that many people are doing it right now. Demand seems quite a bit lower than a 1080 card, but it still worked really well overall. The existing alternatives are much more expensive. This is $400. Magewell has a Magewell Pro Capture HDMI 4K Plus, which has the worst name on the planet, and that's $800 to $900. Magewell does have a heatsink and fan. The 4K 60 Pro does not. More on that later. Doesn't matter a whole lot for this particular product, but this card, the Elgato one, has functional drivers and software for Windows 10, and we had issues with those drivers working properly even on Windows 10. So on versions of Windows 10 from before the Fall Creators Update, we would run into a catastrophic issue that required removing the card, uninstalling the drivers, inserting the card, reinstalling the drivers, and then it would work again. But updating to 1709 resolved all of those problems for the Windows version. The software is not much different from Virtual Dub or OBS. It actually does a lot less than either of those two things. It makes it easier for new users, but we'd recommend other software if you want more control. You can toggle between CPU or GPU encoding. You'll need their software for that. There's a bitrate slider, and that's about it. So using Virtual Dub or OBS, it's possible to capture higher bit rates. I/O on the back is limited to HDMI input and output, and there's not any meaningful amount of latency visibly noticeable during the capture process with this card. So that's not really a concern either. Let's talk about thermals though. This was more a curiosity just for fun. In theory, if you have this in a system, what you're probably doing is if it's not in a test bench, you're sitting it in a system below a GPU, and these days probably above a power supply shroud. So it's really going to be limited for its airflow options, and it's got a GPU above it. If it's not doing a lot of work, it'll help cool down the backside of this. If it's doing a lot of work, it'll heat it up. So we're going to go through some of the numbers. For assembly, it's 4 screws, very easy to take apart. We have thermocouples on here. You can see them sticking out of the card. There's a venting slat here. It looks like there's a fan in there. There's not. It looks like there's a heatsink in there. There's not. It does not make contact to the PCB whatsoever on the front side. It's actually just a hollow shell. And then on the back side, there are no thermal pads. There's no direct contact except for maybe in one instance to the back plate. So all the heat, for the most part, is transferred via radiation, not via conduction, which is far less efficient. And it's not really meant to be a heatsink in that regard. This does one of two things. It looks cool, or it keeps console players, I guess in the eyes of Elgato, from touching things they shouldn't if they don't know what they're doing. I don't know, but I think it's more of a looks cool thing. So getting to the thermals, the backplate would also be great for sinking heat away from hot areas on the PCB, except again, no thermal pads or points of contact at all with the metal shell in general. There are some small vent holes cut in the front. It's otherwise sealed. And in the case of testing 4K60, we've noticed that it gets pretty warm without active airflow on it, even on an open air test bench. And this was to the point that it get unpleasantly hot to the touch. So we decided to stick thermocouples on it, but we also tested with a 140mm NDXT radiator fan to blow air out over the test bench during testing, which helped a lot. But we've seen multiple pictures of builds where 4K60s or HD60 Pro cards are jammed in next to GPU backplates with no room for ventilation or just a PSU shroud. For thermal testing, we first took thermographic images of the card when its heatsink was fully disassembled, which was really meant to give us spot measurements. So a couple of things here. Thermographic imaging is misused a lot in tech media. People will use it to get an actual measurement of something, but that's not really what you're supposed to be doing when you're taking an image of a graphics card. The way we use it is strip all the parts off, get rid of anything that's going to cause emissivity or reflectivity issues with a thermal camera, take a picture of a black body component like an SMD, and then use that to determine where we should put thermocouples for properly accurate measurements. So we determined that there were two places that got pretty hot and they were opposing each other. They're on either side. So one component is right here on the back, another one's on the same spot on the front, and those components are the large silicon lattice semiconductor part and also the dual port HDMI receiver. So that's where we put the thermocouples. And although the cover looks like a heatsink, again, it's not. So let's look at the numbers. The first thermal test with the covers on is stock configuration. The test was started with the system off, so there were a few seconds of near ambient temperatures at the beginning, and it was a little warm from earlier use. After that, there were relatively slow increases in temperature as the system was turned on. The Xbox was off at this point, all software was closed, and the card wasn't doing any real work. But it did still pull some power while idling, of course. Once the Xbox was turned on and the card began passing through an HDMI signal, temperatures rose abruptly. We had the capture utility open, which doesn't seem to matter, but we were not recording, and the card was just passing signal from the card to our monitor during this part of the test. We waited for the temperatures to reach steady state, which happened at around 86 degrees Celsius on the front, 79 on the back, and then we began to record some gameplay. Once recording started, using the Elgato 4K capture utility, GPU accelerated, the temperature initially went down and began to fluctuate more. That's because our GTX 1080 FTW had been idling up until that point and the fans were not spinning, but the NV encoder load caused them to activate and begin moving air across the test bench. We could control for this, of course, but it's a good example of the kind of behavior that might be seen in a real use case. Temperatures continued to climb and then leveled out around 90 degrees Celsius on the front and 84 on the back with this experiment going. We experimented with switching to OBS at higher settings during this part of the test, but there wasn't a noticeable effect. We then placed a 140mm fan on top of the test bench, which is what we do when we actually need to capture footage. Temperatures instantly dropped as expected and leveled out around 75 degrees Celsius on the front, 69 degrees Celsius on the back when using the fan. We stopped logging here, but the card retained heat in the metal plates for quite a long time after being turned off. Here's the test data when the cover is off. The card idled at around 35 degrees Celsius with the cover off and no HDMI signal going through it. 35C is fine, it's above ambient a bit, but it's not going to overheat just by idling, of course. Once the Xbox was turned on and the card began passing a signal through, temperatures rapidly rose without the benefit of the metal casing to soak up heat. It was also less insulated though. So we reached steady state around 69 degrees Celsius on the front, 66 on the back, even once recording started. This is superior to the 84 degree and 90 degree temperatures of the test with the cover on, which is more to look cool than to be cool. Again, adding a fan to the test bench lowered the card's temperatures drastically. The test finished up around 47 degrees Celsius on the back and 49 on the front. The duration of this whole test was much shorter than the first one, note the time scale, as the lack of metal to soak up and retain that heat did make the changes much more rapid. We lose that soaking ability. We never saw any performance loss with this though. So although the temperatures are getting to levels of being more or less unacceptable for these silicon components, even though we're there, we didn't drop more frames. There's no performance degradation. Now, the problem you might run into is this was on an open air bench. If you have this in a poorly ventilated case, under a GPU and above a PSU shroud, your thermals will be worse. And I don't know what kind of protections are on these cards. I don't know if they have over temperature protection. But regardless if they do or not, it doesn't really matter. The point is you've got stuff getting really hot. And over time, you could have things like capacitor bulging that would damage or destroy the usability of the card. So thermals are certainly, we would like to see Elgato improve the thermals on this, and they could do it by not building a literal heat trap on the card. That'd be a good start. Maybe, connect the big piece of metal that's over it to a component on the card so it's actually sinking heat and exposing it to the outside where you've got airflow. That'd be a good start. We'd like to see that. It's not something that ruins the usability of the product. It worked fine. If you're in a case with poor airflow, please make sure you put fans in there so that it can actually breathe, and that'll solve most of your problems. As far as the product itself, it worked pretty well for a 4K capture. We didn't really have problems with the product. The software is pretty bad. It's got some bugs. We've had a lot of crashes. It does not play well with older versions of Windows 10 even. You want FC or later. And it also is very limited in its options. We found OBS or even Virtual Dub, which is basically a 20-plus-year-old project maintained by college students for free. We found both of those to work better. So if you're looking at buying it, consider those. But the Elgato stuff's okay. It's frustrating sometimes. That does 140 megabits. You can do more on the other software. The other oddity, of course, again, 4K60 doesn't apply to a lot of console games. Works fine for PC. We tried it. It handles actual 4K60 just fine, and the playback is no problem. We've been playing clips probably through this whole video, and it all looks good. So the only real bottleneck in terms of performance and frame drops are the games, especially for the consoles. $400 is a pretty good price, but there's no point in buying the card unless you're actually going to use it for 4K60. If your internet doesn't support it and you're live streaming, then don't bother unless you're going to upgrade your upload speed soon. If you're capturing local and then uploading later, it's worthwhile if you can actually play the games at 4K60 on the host system. And other than that, the 1080p versions of all the million capture cards that are out there for 1080p 60 are cheaper, better alternatives if you're not legitimately transmitting 4K somewhere to the internet at some point. So that's kind of how we look at this. There's a $200 Blackmagic Intensity Pro 4K. We can't vouch for its quality. We haven't tested it, but we did see it. we used to use a Vision card that's an SE2 HD4, I believe is the model. We use that for VR capture. It's like $2,000 plus. So the disparity is large, and it can't even do 4K 60 like this can, but it does a lot of other things. So different tools for different jobs. And then of course there are plenty of more expensive options as well, but this seems to work pretty well. It works well for something that's in between $200 and $2,000. The $400 4K 60 is fine. It's just make sure you actually will use it, because if you're not going to, because your internet's bad or something, and you're streaming, then there are cheaper options that do the job fine with 1080p 60. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Some interesting data on thermals. There's not really anything you can do about it other than put a fan in the case and make sure it points generally towards the capture card. You're not going to lose performance probably, unless it gets really bad. But you might have component degradation over time, which will not manifest itself as decay in performance. This is something that it's a common misconception. People think that video cards from overuse will decay in performance, for example. Same thing with this. That's not really true. It's just an instantaneous failure. So you go from working like it's always worked to not working. It works fine until it doesn't, in other words. So with the kind of temperatures we're dealing with on this, if it's used in a low airflow case, over time you could have cap bulging or popping, and that's it. So just make sure there's a fan on there. But otherwise, it's fine. So yeah, thanks for watching. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one, or one of our mod mats, which are on back order but shipping within the next couple of weeks now. And we sold out instantly last time, so get in early if you want one. Otherwise, go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly and get behind the scenes video access. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.